Okay. All right. How do you change your plan?
We are live stream.
Well, I called my daughter, so I'm gonna go down a day early so that I can leave a bit early.
All right, we're ready?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to call the November 1st Planning and Programming Committee meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to start with the summary notes from the October 4th meeting. They're in your packet. Are there any corrections, modifications, suggestions? Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve, Chair Wilson.
Motion by Mayor Michelle, seconded by Chair Wheeler. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. We're now going to go to the approval of goals, objectives, and performance measures for transaction update. Mr. Jasper.
Thank you, Wilson. Members of the committee, welcome. We have before you the action item related to goals, objectives, and measures for transaction. Mr. Harrington is going to talk us through what's changed since we last discussed this topic in your previous meeting and I think several meetings before that as well. Before he starts, I'd just like to emphasize that the goals, objectives, and measures are part of a process that also includes the approval of weights associated with the measures, which is what will be coming up for action before the committee at the next meeting, and also the projects that are in transaction for which our evaluation process will be applied. So, how any combination of projects perform within transaction is dependent upon the goals, objectives, and measures, and particularly the measures, because there are methodologies associated with the measures, which will be used to calculate impacts, and then the weights will be used to assess, the impacts to reflect your priorities as reflected through the weights, and then they will be applied to the projects. So, if there are particular projects or particular types of impact we're looking for, in order for the desired outcome, those projects need to be in transaction as well. So think of this as part of the process. What we've discussed and we're going to present with you tonight, we consider to be very holistic, very comprehensive, and includes everything we think you could possibly want to do when it comes to having us evaluate projects that are in transaction. And the key thing will be, as I say, is what's coming up next, which is the determination of the weights that are associated with the measure. So with that, I'll hand off to Tom, and then I'll come back at the end and we can start.
Thank you. So we'll start with some key terms. First, we'll start with goals and core values. We've talked a lot about those, and they form a basis, the policy basis for a transaction. But we thought it was important to distinguish between goals, which are what we want to achieve, namely enhance mobility, increase accessibility, improve resiliency, and then the core values being how we want to achieve them. So we want to achieve those goals equitably, sustainably, and safely. And when we spend a little more time looking at measures, we're going to talk about the core values and how they are associated with multiple goals. We've done some work trying to align them with the different measures. And similarly, goals are interconnected and there is overlap. So some strategies that help achieve the mobility goal will also have benefits on accessibility and so forth. So these are just a few key concepts, I guess, before we get into looking at the actual measures. Next slide on objectives and performance measures, which we've talked about in prior meetings. Objectives being how we sort of take those goals and break them down into more measurable, targeted actions that will result in incremental but tangible advancement toward the goals. Performance measures being how we evaluate the impacts of policies, programs, projects, and scenarios affecting the transportation system, and really are how we measure progress towards achieving the goals. And then, as Keith mentioned, performance measures can be weighted differently, which we'll talk about later, to reflect the region's priorities. When we were selecting performance measures, again, we were looking for measures that would incorporate all modes and project types, reflect the core values, be restricted in number, so the set of measures is a little smaller than it was in the previous transaction, be capable of robust and consistent measurement, and then be easy to communicate to and understood by the public. So that's just kind of basic background on those, and then we've got some sort of follow-up on committee feedback that we heard really starting in July through September. But some of the more recent comments we'd heard, first, adding a method for analyzing non-motorized projects. So in response to that, how we're going to treat non-motorized projects. Primarily under objective A, we have a reduced congestion and delay objective. And so any changes, we will test changes, the bike and ped type projects, and those will show up in our reductions in delay in one specific place. Second, there's a request to move the emissions reduction objective from mobility to the resiliency goal. That was a request we got from multiple committees, and that has actually been done. So it's been moved, emissions moved from mobility to under resiliency. Also had some comments around bike accessibility. How can we incorporate that? And so we have updated the accessibility objective measure to incorporate bike access. On the emissions measure itself, feeling was that it's be more explicitly related to emissions. Previously, we just listed that as a BMT measure, so that's been sort of updated, refined to clarify that this is specifically related to emissions, although based on BMT at different speed levels as part of the input to how that's calculated. Including pedestrian and bike modes and safety measures was suggested, and no action needed. That safety improvements would incorporate all modes. And then finally, request to look at a measure of network redundancy under the resiliency goal. We have updated the measure for objective G to reflect redundancy, and we'll look at that a little more. Measures. Other feedback from committees. Include a method for supporting investment in the regional activity centers. No change there. The improvements that affect regional activity centers will be incorporated in our accessibility measurement. We're not specifying just how the regional activity centers do versus other areas, but they will be sort of accounted when we look at the accessibility gains. Next was looking at adding access to other types of destinations. The idea being, if we just focus on jobs, are we missing other trip purposes? But we, not making change, but want to make the point that jobs serve as a proxy for other trip types. So when we see jobs, that can also be at medical centers, at schools, at retail establishments. And so that allows us to identify those as places that we need to improve accessibility. Comment about changing the emissions objective to account for all emissions, not just transportation. We did not make a change there. Transaction is a transportation plan, and so our analysis really can only measure transportation emissions. And then finally, request to look at including wait time in the calculation of transit delay. That's another one we didn't make a change. Again, it's a measure of delay, and wait time is really an expected part of transit travel. So we didn't want to include that. For commenting here, we also don't want to calculate the measure in a way that you would have an increase in transit time just because you have more transit ridership. So in the end, that was one we did not change the measure for. All right, so next slide, slide 9, is summary of the goals, objectives, and measures. Again, you've seen the 3 goals: mobility, accessibility, resiliency. Those are aligned with 7 objectives, A through G. And then kind of nested within the objectives, we have 1 or more measures for each of those objectives. And then on the far right, that's the alignment with core values that I mentioned. So we have 3 icons. Scale is the equity, The hand holding the leaf is sustainability, and then the safety vest person represents safety. So again, a lot of overlap in some of these where they may affect more than one core value, but we've tried to show where it aligns sort of best with the core values. So that's the quick overview.
Thanks, Tom. And so before your discussion and action, just one more thing I'd like to say is we've talked at quite a number of the meetings about the measures and the methodologies associated with the measures. We are in the process of producing a technical document that summarizes the detailed methodologies and whether they are model-based, qualitative, off-model in some way. So we don't have that available yet. What I would say is all the discussions we've had with you so far regarding methodologies still holds. We're not looking to go off in significantly different directions with the methodologies for actually calculating the measures. But to simplify the discussion, we've taken the methodologies part out of this presentation, although Tom will be, I'm sure, more than happy to talk about the methodologies associated with any of the performance measures. But as I say, it's very consistent with all previous conversations. There's no surprises, nothing what I would call a surprise in terms of change of direction calculations, other than where there may have been some minor tweaks in the performance measure itself. By and large, there have been no changes.
Okay, questions?
Sure, let me start with some questions. So I participated by the phone on last week's sort of roundtable on the authority. I didn't hear consensus on a couple of key issues, and I'm going to really deal with them as questions because they are extremely complicated. The first one is the issue of reduced congestion. One could say every highway, by definition, every highway expansion, every new highway, by definition, would both deal with congestion and produce less emissions because fossil fuel cars driving at roughly 55 miles per hour are the most efficient and the least emitting. Of course, we know over time, the more roads bring more cars, bring more development, bring congestion, and actually create emissions. So my question is, without getting into an us versus them debate, how do we include that notion in what we're doing here? So that's question number one. Question number two, the region has set greenhouse gas emissions.
Actually, you want to let them answer the first one?
Well, let me just go through all.
Okay, all right.
The region has set greenhouse gas emissions targets. What in these goals and objectives will assure that NVTA will, whatever we approve, will actually achieve those objectives? And the third issue relates to, of course, transit-oriented development and how we are supporting that in terms of the transportation component. So these are all questions which I've been wrestling with, and they're highly complicated questions. And I'm not sure that we're really going to drive toward an overall program that does all those things and is yet flexible enough to deal with different needs. For example, starting with the City of Falls Church, we have people who have 2 square miles driving to go to the grocery store because they need something to pick up the groceries. In our case, microtransit may be something that would achieve that objective. In other parts of the region where they're more spread out, there are other answers to it. Perhaps microtransit in areas where have been developed from an urban standpoint, and long-haul transit for the other areas. areas as well as necessary growth. So I'm trying to figure out what we're going to end up with at the end if we use all these goals and objectives. So that's the fundamental question. The easier question is we're referring to resiliency goal in terms of redundancy. I don't think resilience is necessarily redundancy. Resilience could be you have one system, but you operate it and you design it better. So I think we're too limiting our performance measure for resiliency. So let me just put all these out for discussion purposes. Again, I'm not trying to get into the old classic fight, but really ask questions. How are we going to achieve these established objectives with these proposed goals and measures?
Can I interject with one thing about
Sure will.
something that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. You made the statement that induced demands, you build the roads and the development follows, and then you have greater emissions. Well, in our case, we built the development and then we needed the roads. And so I just take objection to the fact that the idea that you build the roads and the development follows, because we're doing the development anyway, and that's why we're building the roads. And I just want to be clear on that point that, we're playing catch up. We're never playing ahead. Sorry.
Mayor Rochelle.
And whatever development that we are building, we're building in response to the jobs that are being created on to live in Northern Virginia. So I just wanted to title on what you're doing. So.
All right, so why don't we go back to Councilmember Snyder's question?
Okay, I'll be happy to start off, and I'm going to get to the limit of my technical familiarity. I'm going to pump it up to this guy. But let me start by Councilmember Snyder's question about induced demand, how it relates to congestion, emissions, and how we're going to address this. It's a good question, and we've heard from the Chair William and Mayor Wilson some thoughts on induced demand as well, and that I guess is a good kind of cross section of the feeling on induced demand. For us, it's a technical consideration in our approach, and so our approach looks at induced demand. Well, first of all, we've got to back up and just be absolutely clear. We are all talking apples to apples here, so we understand what induced demand is and what it isn't. For us, induced demand is the generation of trip making, which has only occurred because of the infrastructure that's been built. In other words, it's trips that were not previously being made that are induced to happen because the infrastructure change is so large that new travel opportunities become available. That is what we mean by induced demand. Induced demand is one reason why travel demand on facilities, new facilities, as well as upgraded existing facilities, can sometimes lead to more travel. We expect more travel to happen as a result of any infrastructure. Otherwise, why would we be doing it in the first place? And a lot of that increased demand is perhaps diversion of trips in terms of route choice, in terms of trips are starting and finishing in different places because the cost of travel effectively has been reduced. And some effects are short term, some are medium term, some are long term. I think Tom would argue that our approach certainly addresses induced demand effects in the short and the medium term, and in the longer term, it's a bit more difficult to predict what scale of induced demand is going to happen because by nature it's travel that's not happening now. So the way we address that is, in fact, turning it around on you is by using the long-term forecasts that are generated by your respective planning directors for growth within the region, which are then processed by COG and TPB to update their models and then their most updated models for the future, which takes into account the sort of growth expansion that Chair Wheeler and Mayor Rochelle referred to, is embodied in the travel demand aspects of the models that we're using. So we're doing everything we can reasonably do in approaching induced demand. And I think somewhere around this table, I think we could have a debate as to even whether induced demand is a good or a bad thing. That depends on your perspective. I've heard it argued both ways. But for us, the fundamental thing here is the region is growing. I think we've got the numbers in this presentation, or maybe not, but we talked about them at the work session last week, where we're looking at mid-20s % in terms of population growth through 2045, upper 30% in terms of job growth through 2045. These numbers are built into the model, and to the extent that the planning directors at your respective jurisdictions consider this is what the proposed development in your respective localities is going to generate, it's the models are already dealing with it because that growth is already built into the model. Now, if there's extra over-induced demand, I think we probably are not going to capture that. But it's also hard to know exactly how big that is and where it would even occur. I don't think we can just take a blanket approach and say, within a certain number of years, everything's going to be back to how it was before we did anything. I think that's somewhat misleading because we've essentially added capacity to the system, which means more economic activity can occur. So, you can argue that it's enabled growth. I'm not going to argue it one way or another, whether it's good or a bad thing. But to the extent that our technical approach allows, we do address induced demand. I don't think it's directly relevant to the goals, objectives, and measures that we've got here. I think the question is more about the technical approach that we're using through our modeling platforms, which incorporate Colgan CPV's modeling platforms very explicitly. Tom, did you want to add anything?
I think that covered. I guess just to re-emphasize the short and the medium responses are ones the model can pick up. And we do that through feedback loops. So when we calculate measures like delay and severe congestion, we don't just look at the benefit when you suddenly widen a road. What's the delay? The model does a feedback loop where it looks at that benefit and then it cycles back the approved speed and then it sees if there are any shifts in demand, and then we sort of recalculate again. So there's a sort of an iterative cycle before we land at the equilibrium where we actually calculate measures like delay and congestion. So that's what we meant by the short and the medium term are accounted for in the model. And then long term, of course, is land use to the extent that the cooperative forecasts do consider changes in regional accessibility, like opening the Silver Line and widening major roadways. To the extent those things are pulled into the land use, then we've incorporated some of the land use, the long-term effects as well.
Can I ask, if a road is widened or newly built facility, does it help a transit vehicle with headway regarding its ability to move quicker, if you will? And would the model capture that? I guess that's my real question.
We are taking, we are using congested speeds for, buses when they're in mixed traffic and so forth.
Because that's something we struggle with in this region. If you have a bus that has dedicated guideway or fixed guideway, if you will, in the case of some DRT can be a little different, different things, but where you have preemptive signalization versus buses that are in the HOV lane per se, which sometimes get crowded as well.
But yeah, that's the intent of, we have this measure hours of delay on transit, and then we have another measure in terms of the person miles and dedicated priority right of way. So both of those are meant to give credit for when we can get transit out of congested streets and into either their own right of way or free flowing right of way.
The other thing I would say, just at this time, in conclusion on induced demand, is induced demand where it occurs can be mitigated. This is something that kind of speaks to the economic principle on which induced demand is based, which is that the cheaper the less expensive a good or a service becomes, the greater the consumption of that good or service will be. And in this case, if you think of roadway capacity as or transit capacity for that matter, being a good or service which is expanded, it becomes easier to use, effectively, therefore reducing the cost of using that system. And if there are genuine concerns about a high level of induced trip making, where trips are not currently being made or not included in any model, then the way that we would propose that those effects be mitigated is by some level of pricing on the facility. Because in effect, by pricing it using actual dollars, the cost savings that you're making by having the ability to move through a system faster, essentially, if you're paying for the ability to move through a system faster, at some level of cost, it's going to cancel itself out. So if the cost of the facility, using the facility does not reduce because you priced it, then you actually get the increased throughput with no possibility of induced demand. Now, it's all very wonky at this point because we're talking about hypotheticals here, but I think when you talk about induced demand, you can't ignore the fact that there are ways to mitigate it as well. So it will depend on the scale of the improvement, the type of facility that we're talking about. Is it a freeway? Is it a primary? Is it a secondary? Is it local facility? So the type of facility, the scale of the improvement, whether or not it's priced, these things all play into whether or not induced demand will happen and to what level. And so we can't talk about one without understanding the other and understanding where certain types of improvements will have differing scales of impact. It is an enormously, I agree with Councilmember Snyder, it is an enormously complex area. With modeling, we can do our best, but I think it still requires a lot of professional judgment as well.
Wheeler.
Just a sort of a general question. The more heavily weighted focus on congestion, wouldn't it be, it would be more heavily weighted on an existing problem rather than an induced problem? If an area is heavily congested and we weight congestion, doesn't that by nature say we're addressing an existing problem as opposed to one that's been induced?
Tom will weigh in, but the way it will work is, we use a performance measure to look at like a build versus a low build scenario. So in the build scenario, we'll aggregate it across the system, across the region. We'll see if total journey time goes down, then if that's something that's weighted at let's say 90%, that's an unrealistically high number. Then what it will do is it will give a lot of points to projects that are achieving that reduction in congestion. If on the other hand it's weighted at 10%, it's obviously going to be a whole lot less. And so the higher the weighting on a particular measure, that will, if the project is having that sort of impact combined with a high weighting, then those sorts of projects will score better, is the way it will work.
Other questions?
I've got the other questions.
You got that.
I mean, if I can go on to Councilmember Snyder's second question, the region has set targets. I think it's in the context of climate change. What will NVTA do to ensure these are achieved? This is where my introductory comment about weights really is pertinent. Okay, so the weights will be, I'm always jumping ahead to an information item. It's at the agenda end of the agenda. But the way each of the committees, when we get to the next meeting, will have a discussion on what the committee feels are the right weights for the approved goals, objectives, and measures. I don't want to be presumptuous here and assume the authority is going to approve anything at this stage, because that's not my position to take. So, this is all dependent upon authority approval at your meeting on November 18th. If you approve the measures at that meeting, we will immediately go into a discussion on the weights associated with these 10 measures. And so there's one measure in particular, F1, which is related to vehicle emissions. If members want to place a high weighting on vehicle emissions to reflect the greater region's climate change goals, then that's the way it will flow. And changing the measures doesn't make any difference, I don't believe, because we have a measure for vehicle emissions. It's covered in what we've got here. Where it really plays is going to be how those measures get weighted. So the process will be this committee and the two statutory committees will each decide in aggregate what they recommend the weight should be for each of these 10 measures. And then as staff, what we will do is simply look at the aggregate outcome for each of the three committees, average them, round them to the nearest 5%, and present them to the authority for consideration. That's the kind of the fairest way we think we can do it, reflecting the positions of the two statutory committees and the standing committee. Obviously, each committee will only make recommendations. The authority will take the final action on what those should be. So, if you feel that the priority should be given to vehicle emissions, then presumably that will be reflecting in discussion. The only thing I would say is, as Batman is going to be very diligent here to make sure that in setting the weights, the authority doesn't put itself in any violation of the code in so and that's really speaking to the in terms of investing your regional revenues in projects has to respect the Virginia Code requirement to give priority to projects that achieve the greatest congestion reduction relative to cost. As I said at the work session last week, it is entirely possible to have projects that address congestion but do other things. So I don't see it as an either or, them versus us or anything like that. But it does require a collaborative process through each committee and ultimately through the authority as to what your priorities are. We're not going to tell you what your priorities are. It's going to be you're going to tell us what your priorities are, and we will put those numbers into the evaluation process. So that's how it would work.
So how are you interpreting the test for the 599 requirements? Like how are you, what are you determining as non-compliant from a weighting perspective?
For HB 599, we have to address certain things, but that really described at a high level, and providing performance measure G1 and objective G are incorporated, by precedent. We've established that it's a particular requirement of HB 599 with respect to homeland security evacuation. We've broadened it to be something that is more relevant to transportation system operations during extreme conditions, where the extreme conditions may be nothing related to homeland security, but it is covered by that. So provided we keep that in, HB 599 is silent on what the actual weight should be. It's HB 2313 where the language about congestion reduction relative to cost is embodied, which is obviously the legislation which granted the initial revenue stream to the authority, and that.
So you're not saying that there's a there's a particular weighting associated with some of these measures
below which you cannot go. I think you're saying in general terms, these are, there are certain, some of these weightings are not equal with the others in that they have the force of law and that therefore they need to be satisfied in some way.
That's correct, but
But yeah,
the law is silent on any specific.
I got it.
that is what we're saying, Chair Wilson, and I would add, that relative cost portion of the law is very important as well, because you could have a project that achieves, it could rank number one when we're doing our congestion reduction relative to cost evaluation, and this is getting to the funding side. But let's say it's $1 billion. Now, you as the authority may say, well, the congestion reduction aspects are great, the costs are too high. And then we also look at the time it takes to implement. Some of the smaller projects can be implemented a lot sooner. Therefore, we receive the congestion reduction benefit a lot sooner than some of the other projects. For us, it's a congestion reduction relative to cost, and we have to document. What I will note, before we did our inaugural 6-year program, and it could have been a little earlier, we were weighting congestion reduction at 40%. And then Smart Scale / HB2 came online. And for Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia, Smart Scale had to give the weight congestion reduction highest in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. And so that process was weighting congestion reduction at 45%. So we increased our weight for congestion reduction to 45%, even though the processes are a little different. We wanted to ensure or show the public we both understood the law and we were locked in step regarding the weight.
And just a little comment on this, because I recall back when we set the Homeland Security, I had thought it was set at 5%. I thought at that time 5% was not enough, but everybody seemed to think that 5 was plenty enough. But I wanted to comment on the greenhouse gas issue. I see this as somewhat related to the enhancement of economic development and economic prosperity. It's not our direct responsibility to do that, but it has definitely been a byproduct of what the good work that the NVTA has done and the projects that have been approved. There's been a phenomenal economic impact in the Northern Virginia region, and just simply for doing a good job. And I think that reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, if we can reduce congestion and continue to fund all modes of transportation, that reduction of greenhouse gases will probably follow along after that.
I guess that's the question I'm asking, Bill.
Can you repeat the question?
The statement was made, and it's legitimate, entirely legitimate. There's no question that it's entirely important. But the question was, if we reduce congestion, the greenhouse gas reductions will follow. So hypothetically, we build a bunch of roads, we reduce congestion, and if our fossil fuel vehicles, you haven't really met your greenhouse gas reduction goals. So I want to keep coming back to how are we going to meet these goals and how is this plan and these objectives going to help us do it? I have a totally open mind.
Sure. But I mean, we can get into the detailed methodology. Essentially, we mentioned BMT, vehicle miles traveled, earlier. So, within the model, the way that calculation will work will be, obviously, if VMT is reduced, then at least if it's reduced by vehicles that are emitting internal combustion engine powered vehicles, if the VMT associated with those vehicles is reduced, then that will reduce emissions. I don't think there's any dispute about that. Similarly, when you look at the efficiency curve of vehicles in the aggregate, they tend to be very inefficient at slow speeds, at high speeds. And so if congestion is reducing the amount of time spent in those inefficient parts of the performance curve, then our calculation will recognize that, and that'll be weighted with whatever the approved weighting is that's associated with congestion. Obviously, if there are projects that help to decarbonize the transportation system, be that through electric vehicles in different parts of the fleet, then that will have an impact too, as will retrofitting facilities to enable EV infrastructure for charging purposes, transit vehicles or whatever. So there I think are the three main ways our approach will capture reductions in emissions. So it isn't just about reducing congestion. That's a part of it, but I think it's also about reducing VMT. So any project which reduces VMT, reduces VMT during congested conditions, or just simply replaces internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles will all be credited for reducing emissions.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, remember.
And I genuinely don't know the answer to this. How are our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions measured now? Are they measured in bulk? Are they measured per resident, per locality? Because if we don't take into consideration that there will be a tremendous amount of growth in the region, then it may be a feather in everyone's cap just to hold people. So I genuinely don't know how it's measured right.
Well, our approach is going to be primarily a model-based approach. So like I said earlier, we'll be comparing, looking at future year 2045, we'll be looking at a no-build situation and the emissions associated with that through modeling output versus a build situation where the projects are included, the measures are applied with the weights that have been approved, and that will give us an indication of the performance of that group of projects in the build network. So for us, it's a model-based approach, a with and without kind of a comparison tool.
So your model does take into consideration the tremendous growth by say 2045.
Correct.
And what that impact will be on greenhouse gas. Am I reading too much into
In
that?
terms of what the emissions, what the greenhouse gas emissions from any internal combustion engine powered vehicles would be. I mean, there's some averaging where we can't do it at the individual vehicle level, right? We have to make some assumptions about the composition of the vehicle fleet when we do that, including the hope for increasing market penetration of zero emissions vehicles, which we'll have to build in some assumptions to look at that. But we'll be totally transparent with you about what assumptions we're making, and I don't know if it's a negotiation as to what the assumptions should be. I think we need to leave the consultant to come up with their best professional judgment to tell us what the appropriate number is, and we will be transparent about what that assumption is.
Let me take a swag at answering Councilmember Schneider's question, because I think the answer to this question is not necessarily the inventory of performance measures as much as it is the weight of those performance measures. So I think the weighting conversation is far more important. Because my personal view is, right, you can, I think Councilmember Schneider is exactly right, that you can reduce congestion in a way that ultimately will increase greenhouse gas emissions and go in the wrong direction as it relates to our climate goals. But you can also do it in a way that will be beneficial, and I think it's just going to depend on the project, and I think as a consequence, it's probably a looking at these measures, to get to where I think you want to get to and where I would like to get to, it's going to require projects that are going to certainly satisfy a reduction in dependence on driving alone, so access to transit, access to jobs, car transit, et cetera.
reductions in vehicle emissions and transportation system redundancy, but ultimately with a goal of reducing congestion in the region. And so it's how you weight those and how you prioritize those. Because I think clearly if if you just said, like, to the extreme example, right, we said 100%, we wanted to reduce congestion and delay, that was the only priority. Well, then, you lay just, tons and tons of asphalt all over the place, and you could reduce congestion, at least for a short-term period of time. I think you're right about the ultimate long-term induced demand effect. But so, I think this is a question. I think in the end, this becomes a question not about the inventory of performance measures, but really about how we weight them and apply them. But this is my view. Other chairman.
I know that in different groups I have sat in on, they talked about the effect of what would happen if we got rid of all the new road projects and what effect it would have on greenhouse gases. And I remember them saying it would only have a 2% effect. And I couldn't find that study, but what I did find was, how are we going to get there? I found the COG, what it would take scenario results and how COG lays out getting to their goal, right? And so and this is just a draft, but it's online too. When you look at it, the vast majority of it, they say, are going to come from, clean electricity, zero energy buildings, and zero emission vehicles. Those three basically dwarf everything else. And when they talk about mode shift and travel behavior, it's a really very thin amount. And so it's not that NVTA shouldn't care about emissions, because we should all care about emissions, but the question is, how are we going to get to our regional goals? A lot of it's going to be through clean electricity, energy building, sustainability, as well as, I would argue, zero emission vehicles, and electrifying our grid and building infrastructure, especially in the outer jurisdictions. And that's where we're going to get the most bang for a buck. And the NVTA, with our whatever decisions we make, won't have a great deal of impact per se, because we can't build infrastructure, because it doesn't reduce congestion, unfortunately. Even though it was a suggestion I made last week, how
I'm
we
talking
get
to
there.
the attorney.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, so COG does say, how are we going to get there? This is their sort of vision of how we get there. And it has very little to do with.
And I would know, I think in that the top work, they're saying that 90% of emissions are two things: the build energy, and then 40% transportation. And I think Keith was reading a report from the Biden administration today that said if we had zero emission vehicles, we could get to, what's the group, Keith? The global.
This is the document that Mark is referring to as prepared by the Biden administration, the presentation to COP26 in Glasgow today. It's 65 pages long. I've only scanned it to about the midpoint of this document, but it lays out the federal government strategy to achieving a maximum of a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature above pre-industrial levels through a variety of means, including transportation. And this is the bit I haven't got to yet, but in terms of the transportation piece of that, as Chair Wheeler said, a lot of it is based upon electrification. This is looking out through 2050, by the way. So there's milestones in between, but looking out through 2050, a substantial decarbonization of the transportation fleet, autos, light trucks, heavy trucks, rail, transit, and then obviously shipping and aviation as well, was all part of the strategy that's outlined in this document. There is reference also to active transportation measures, so walk, bike, and then increased use of rail and transit as well is referenced in here, but I can't see to what extent that is a part of the federal government versus kind of extra added impact that's established by state, regional, local governments working like in the way that we're working take us beyond what the federal government's doing. But this document doesn't seem to depend a whole lot on those sorts of activities to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase over the pre-industrial global temperature, which is, I think, the stretch goal for 2050. I think the Paris Treaty actually spoke about 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, and they're trying to get to 1.5 because 2 degrees Celsius is not a good place to be. 1.5 is not a good place to be, but it's better than 2. So, and obviously, you probably got staff reviewing this yourselves and we'll get a chance to look at it. And we're trying to understand it too. But if I could pivot onto the third question, because it's kind of related. The third question is how is transit oriented supported within transaction? First and foremost, that's a land use item. That's I don't think there's any daylight between us in the NVTA does not do land use. That's a jurisdiction level responsibility. So supporting TOD is first and foremost, we would say, your responsibility, not NVTA's responsibility. In terms of supporting that sort of development, you gave the example of Councilmember Snyder of microtransit in the City of Falls Church, but also mentioned long-haul transit. This is kind of where I was talking earlier about how this process all hangs together. So we've got the goals, objectives, measures we're seeking action on tonight. Over the next month or so, with the committees and the authority, we're looking for action on the weights, essentially your priorities for the region. And the other piece of this are the projects which are in transaction, which are going to be in the build networks that we're evaluating. So the types of projects referred to here, microtransit, long-haul transit, etc. We've been working with jurisdiction staff for many months now to populate a project list for transaction in readiness for when we get all this stuff behind us, approved by the authority and behind us. Using whatever comes out of this process, we'll be applying these metrics and these weights to the projects that are in that list for transaction. So to the extent that your staff have made us aware of the sorts of projects that you want in that transaction project list, they're addressed. We actually established, we NVTA staff established earlier this year a bus rapid transit planning working group. We've established a number of working groups from time to time on very focused topics. We felt that there's been great work being done to date within the region on bus rapid transit. I think the City of Alexandria is probably leading the way with 3 lines. There's a line which runs through the City of Falls Church, the envisioned Route 7 line from Tyson's down to Alexandria. Fairfax County has got its own Route 1 BRT project. I think I'm probably missing 1 or 2. So there's a core, I wouldn't say network because I'm not really sure how interconnected they're going to be, but there's certainly some core lines being discussed. And we established a bus rapid transit planning and working group, which additionally included staff from Montgomery County and Prince George's County, together with the District of Columbia and WMATA bus planners in particular, to try and see what sort of regional BRT network we could conceptualize where these pieces are all linked to each other, which would include extensions of the Route 1 BRT project in Fairfax County down to Prince William County, something similar through the city of Manassas and Prince William County and Manassas Park up to on 28 up to the airport and potentially into Loudon. Obviously, BRT across the river, for which Montgomery County and PG County were extremely happy that we had established this conversation. This is the initiative that NVTA started on behalf of the region to start the dialogue about the sorts of projects that should be considered for inclusion in transaction, because we kind of see these as being, if done right, potentially high impact projects that will reduce congestion. The way our model works, it doesn't have to be a road project to reduce congestion. There's plenty of evidence, Mayor Wilson can attest to, that our analysis shows that metro rail projects reduce congestion as well, and the authority has kind of followed that up with action in terms of investing nearly 70 million in Clement Yard Station, similar amount in Innovation Station, $250 million in Route 1 BRT project, and also the three projects in the city of Alexandria as well. So, I mean, our process, our modeling process does recognize where transit projects have impact on highway congestion. And when requested further funding, so obviously we don't just throw the money around, you've got to request the money from us, but when requested for the funding, those projects tend to perform pretty well through our analysis. And so as a result, they get funded. Not always the case, not always the full amount, because it's a competitive process and there are limited resources. But, so when it comes to the projects, we're doing our best at the regional scale to look at the sort of projects that should be in transaction. We also do a broad sweep of the projects that are in the comprehensive plans that have some regional component to them. Doesn't mean they've got to be big projects, but they've got to have some regional impact, at least in our judgment, to be included in the first place. And we've gone through that process extensively with your staff. But we still got a part of the process which hasn't been completed yet, which will be when Cambridge get all the modelling work set up, and we'll take a look at how the system's performing with the projects that we've got. If we see areas where we think there can be further improvement through additional projects, what we call top-down projects, projects that do not come from a comprehensive plan necessarily, but nonetheless have some regional impact, that's where we start dropping those projects into the process. So there's still a lot of time, for us to work with your staff to kind of identify some of those potentially. So I think that a lot of that will be supportive of TOD, but it's collaborative. We have to work with you and your staff to kind of get to that point. So I think we're good on that one. And then your fourth question was about resiliency, and you said it was referred to in terms of redundancy, and you questioned whether we're limiting our approach. There's a couple of things here. The redundancy measure, as we discussed earlier, is something we have to do to ensure compliance with HB 599. That has to be in there. And yes, there is a difference between redundancy and resiliency, but we've got some precedent for using the measure and the way we've used it in the past. So this set of goals, objectives, and measures will not necessarily come up with what everybody wants and be completely perfect. But as I said in the beginning of my remarks, I think that the intent behind this is pretty solid. It keeps us compliant with the law, and when it comes to resiliency, we'll also be looking at some scenarios to help us better understand if there are alternate futures, what the assumptions that are behind those alternate futures what impact they would have on the performance of the system, and with and without the projects will also come to light as we go through the analytics. So I won't say it's perfect, but I think it's sufficient. And Chair William and Mayor Shah had some comments, but I don't think they were questions. So I don't know if there's anything.
Okay, so and so at the conclusion of this, you're going to want us to endorse the goals, objectives, and performance measures as you proposed, right?
That
Or
would be
some
one
variant
thing
of
we do,
them.
yes.
Okay. All right.
And no pressure, but we have talked already to the Technical Advisory Committee and the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee, and both those committees endorsed what's before you this evening.
And that's one of these.
Slide one.
I'm sorry.
All right, so-
I couldn't hear what Dan said.
I said it's on page 9. It is on page 9. All All right, so are there other questions?
Just a quick comment.
Marisha?
You know, I don't think I'll ever be able to take the bus and purchase groceries. How do you get 6 to 8 bags of groceries back from the grocery store to your home on the bus? I don't know that that's, I think a better example is using doctor appointment, eye appointment, dental appointment. I think groceries is way too hard to navigate bus travel.
You know, a lot of people doing it every single day. They make it happen. All
How
right.
many bags do they have?
I don't know. All right, other questions? Okay, so we do need a motion on the recommending NVTA approval of the transaction goals, objectives, and measures.
I move approval.
Motion by Mayor Rochelle,
I will second.
seconded by Chair Wheeler to recommend approval of proposed goals, objectives, and measures. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay.
Abstain.
And abstention. So it passes 3-0 with 1 abstention.
For reasons of wanting to know the way
All right, and we will get to that discussion in a second. All right, let's go next to the transaction online survey, the interim findings.
In the interest of time, I can try to shorten this. I
Because
know
you did hear it,
a few of the folks.
yeah, well, everyone here will.
Um,
That's okay.
Trying to keep our AAA bond rate.
But I'll do a real quick version and we can spend more time with their questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's an important takeaway. On slide 22, I don't want to rush over all of this, but on slide 22, there's a summary of the key findings. But also, I think the information that is included on, well, I mean, Tom, you pick where to start. There's some, we broke this out at the sub-regional level because at the regional level, it was masking some sub-regional variations in responses. So when you kind of get to that.
Yeah, right. And really the part that's most relevant to weighting is when we talk about the priorities, which is, but yeah, when we looked at the transportation priorities, those in effect are, those priorities align well with the objectives. And so the information we got back on the survey related to priorities is quite relevant to our discussion about weights for different objectives. And so, yeah, this was the area where, given the makeup of the survey, we saw that more transit, walking, and bike was first, but then also reduced congestion and predictability were second and third. But then when we go to the breakdown by subregion, that's where we really started to see these differences by area, where the core, inner jurisdictions were always had the more transit, walking, and biking as the top priority. That remained true for Fairfax County as well. But when we went to the outer jurisdictions, the reduced traffic congestion, was the top choice. And so we make the point, improved reliability was second overall, regardless of area. So that was, the one pattern we saw. And when we looked also at allocating resources, same sort of pattern in terms of the core and inner jurisdictions tended to put rail and bus first and roadway. After that, Fairfax was about even between roadway and rail, and then outer tended to favor roadway construction first, rail second, bus third. So, through those sort of subregions, we do get a sense of how the responses did vary by where people reside.
It's almost like we're all representing our.
Yeah.
Who would have seen that come? Right.
That's not a bad thing.
No, it's
It just
not.
means that we compromise somewhere that is always
It's great.
really what we're doing.
Okay, that's great.
But we're trying to put our regional hat on, we really are.
That's great.
I need a hat right now. I got no hair.
But I think that's the background if, before the discussion of weighting that's probably most relevant. Plus with anything else. Keith.
Any other questions on the survey, before we get to the weighting conversation? All right, do the weighting.
Oh, yeah. We have it on this.
Great.
So, the item 5 on the weightings, just want to quickly go through the process first, which is slide 24. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll be asking each committee to make their own recommendations for each of the approved measures, and the approval is scheduled for the authority meeting on November 18th, but I don't want to presume the outcome of that meeting. So we have to wait to see what those approved measures are, if they're different to what you've just taken action on. And then we go for an average an averaging process, and then rounding to the nearest 5%. And we do the rounding to the nearest 5%, simply to avoid having weights, such as 2.17%, which may be mathematically precise, but difficult to communicate. So we'll try and round everything to the nearest 5%, so that it makes the communication easier. So, I mean, if a weight of, a 2.17 actually did come across, let's say 12.17, that would probably get rounded to 10. And there'll be other weights that will get rounded up. And we'll obviously be clear about what they are. But those sorts of very small differences will have a marginal, potentially negligible effect on the overall analysis, but they make communication of the process to folks around the region who are not as involved in it as we and you are. It'll make it a little bit easier to kind of understand what's going on. We'll also be able to look using the kind of the matrix that was shown earlier on slide 9. In effect, when weights are assigned to the measures, that effectively kind of assigns a weight to the core values as well. So you'll begin to see how the priorities associated with the core values are related as we go through this process. So that'll be an interesting thing to see. The next meeting for this committee is November 29th, and so that's when we'll be asking you to take action. And we wanted to have a conversation with you this evening to kind of get you thinking about where you individually stand on this to be ready for the discussion on November 29th. And so to possibly help with that, the last slide in the deck, slide 25, gives you a little bit of a comparison using the results from the online survey, which Tom just kind of skimmed over quickly. Keep in mind that there are 2,300 responses, so it's probably about 1% of Northern Virginians participated. It was slightly skewed in that we got a higher response rate from core member jurisdictions like Arlington, Alexandria, and Falls Church, and a lower response rate for the outer jurisdictions.
Can we weight the responses?
Well, we've summed them here, both in total and by sub-region. So we don't propose to do any further analysis on this. We just want to be transparent so you could see the sub-regional variations on slide 25. So what you have in the left-hand column are the recommended objectives. These are the ones you've just taken action on. In the next column, the corresponding priority in the online survey, there's actually so there's 7 recommended objectives, and there's 8 corresponding priorities in the online survey, and that's because back in May, June, when we were putting the online survey together, we started with 8 priorities, and as the committees have gone through their process, we've actually consolidated from 8 to 7. But so it's not exactly apples to apples what we show you here, but it's close. And then the third column shows you for the region as a whole what the percent of the weighted score would be for each of the 8 priorities in the online survey. And then in the following 3 columns, we break that out, looking at the core jurisdictions, Arlington and Alexandria, and City Falls Church, the inner jurisdictions, which are Fairfax County and the City of Fairfax, and then the outer jurisdictions, Prince William County, City of Manassas Park, City of Manassas, and Loudoun County. And there are some subtle differences between them, not huge, but there definitely are some trends, which Tom had highlighted in a previous slide. We're just showing it in a different format. And so, I mean, we talked about like transportation-related emissions this evening, and so the region as a whole weighted that at 14%, given those other performance measures that are in here. Core jurisdictions were actually slightly higher at 15, as was the inner jurisdictions also at 15. The outer jurisdictions weighted that slightly lower. And then when you look up to the top row, the recommended objective A, you can kind of see the counterbalancing to some extent, with congestion being rated at 22% among the outer jurisdictions, 18 and inners, 14 with the core jurisdictions. And so, I mean, as you rightly said earlier, these do rather reflect what we would expect based upon you representing your own constituents. So, I mean, it's good to see that the online survey is kind of validating that position, which gives me confidence in the online survey results to a very great extent. There's nothing really weird in here. Just one note about recommended objective D. You'll see for that one there are 2 corresponding priorities. This is where we got the difference between 7 and 8. We wanted to include everything for transparency, so we put them both on the D. So if you added up the 11% for improved multimodal connectivity and the 20% for more transit, walking, biking options, then combined at 31%, they would represent, together the region's highest priority and probably also the highest priority for each of the sub-regions, although to different extents. However, I would say because this is not exactly apples to apples, we do consider that some of this kind of doubling effect is probably going to really happen across other objectives. So it's probably unrealistically high to just simply combine them. We think that should be distributed above other objectives, but we have no basis to be able to tell you to what extent, because the survey wasn't structured that way. All of which is to say, this is not how you should vote. It's a data point. It's a starting point for the conversation, but we felt it'd be useful kind of validate, back to you how people in your respective kind of parts of the region are feeling on things related to the objectives and by extension to the measures. But obviously, an important caveat here is that when people answer the questions, they're almost certainly thinking about their personal circumstances. Transportation is very personal to the individual, and so therefore it will be how they feel about these different priorities. You obviously wearing your regional hats as well as your local jurisdiction hats. Not only have to take a broader view of it than that, but you also have to be thinking out to 2045, whereas most people responding to the survey were thinking about today, and may not necessarily in all cases have the same understanding of the future as we do, because we're professionally involved in it. Whereas for them, it's kind of hit or miss as to what they feel about the future. So, that's another reason for not regarding this as anything other than a starting point. but it is nonetheless, I think helpful. But as we found in the work session last week, when individuals had different positions on the different kind of priorities, and so that's something we would expect from this committee and the other committees when we actually get to discuss it next time. But we would like you to, in preparation for that November 29th meeting, to think about, for the measures on slide 9, which you've just taken action on, how you would allocate 100 points across them. There are 10 of them, so average of 10. Average is not the right approach, I don't think, because different things will be different. Will have differing importance depending on where you are. But start thinking about where you'd allocate 100 points, and you can put 0 on one or more of those. You can put 100 on one of those, but the numbers when we add them up must add up to 100. We can't have 150 points from the city of Alexandria. That would mess up math up. So I mean, however you want to go through that individually with members of your boards, councils, that's your local choice.
So on the 29th, what would you like us to bring?
I mean, if you could look at page 9, the performance measure column.
Yep.
There are 10 performance measures in there.
I know, I get it. I mean, so
Your
you-
weight, your
You
recommended.
want us to
weight.
bring our
Yes.
recommended weight?
Bring your recommended weights, reasons for them. We'll have a
And we'll
discussion.
have what your committee
Yep.
also recommended.
We will have.
Mayor Mitchell.
Great, I'm sorry, I was just a little unclear. We are to rate the performance measures, is that right?
Performance measures,
How
yeah.
you want them weighted?
A numerical value, you think. And it has to add up to 100.
Now, by the time you meet, the technical advisory committee will have met, but the planning coordination advisory committee will not have met. But as I said to you before, our approach will be to take what you tell us at committee level, aggregate at committee level, do the rounding to 5%, and then we'll report out on the 3 committees to the authority at the meeting in December for authority action on the weights.
Yes. Other questions, comments? All right. We'll move on from the weedings to NVTA.
I will be brief. So of course, based on your recommendation tonight for the November 18th authority meeting, we will have authority approval of the goals, objectives, and performance measures for transaction. You'll also hear from the auditors, PD Mayors, on your FY 2021 audit, which was clean, unmodified, but you will hear from them. We will have the first read of the 2022 legislative program on the agenda. And something that's actually tied to my review, approval of the mid-year operating budget adjustment. What I will note, the chair of the technical advisory committee will be at your November 18th meeting. So I think some may not be aware of who he is. And then Mayor Colbert, will attend your December authority meeting, just so you can have interaction with your statutory committee chair. But they will be there if you have any questions or comments on hand. Lastly, we are going to bring as an information item an update on HB 1915. HB 1915, I think, was adopted or passed in 2015. It requires for localities to notify the authorities if there are any changes to the land use or transportation sections in your comprehensive plan that are inconsistent with transaction. We do this every year, but we found that we need a better documentation process. We heard from the localities, no changes. And I will note, the law doesn't require action. It just requires that you notify us of any changes that are inconsistent with transaction. So we will have a report on that. That is all I have, Mr. Chairman.
All right, any other questions? All right, so we are next on the 29th of November, after Thanksgiving. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone. And see you back on the 29th.
Good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yeah, tomorrow.